Harlem, 1968. The streets hum with morning lights, that soft neon flicker riding the mist from a late summer rain. Asphalt gleams like polished steel. Inside a narrow backroom above 116th Street, the air hangs heavy with cigar smoke and money dust. Bumpy Johnson sits still, polished shoes placed apart in perfect geometry. He doesn't speak yet. He doesn't need to. Men in Harlem have learned that his silence is more dangerous than anyone else's anger. Across the table, Frank Lucas watches, trying not to fidget. He's loyal, hungry, and young enough to think loyalty will save him. Between them rests a velvet bag, dark red under the low lamplight. Bumpy slides it forward, just an inch, just enough to make the fabric whisper. The sound seems louder than thunder. Inside the bag lies $1 million, fresh bills, rubber-banded, sharp with the scent of ink and risk. The bag's weight bends the tablecloth slightly, like gravity itself wants to be in on the deal. Bumpy finally exhales, his voice quiet, deliberate. He says a name, then another word, handle it. That's all. No threat, no explanation. Just an instruction that tastes of finality. Frank's mind burns. The man Bumpy wants dead isn't just a rival. He's another piece on Harlem's wide chessboard. To remove him would mean shifting alliances, new wars, new debts. But more than that, Frank sees something in Bumpy's eyes. Not rage, not even fear. This is a test wrapped as an order. For a long moment, no one speaks. You can hear the hum of the streetcar outside, the distant echo of a preacher's shout mixing with the hiss of rain. Then Frank says it, only one word, soft as a sigh, heavy as a crime. No. The silence afterwards stretches like a blade. The men standing behind Bumpy exchange glances, uncertain whether they've just witnessed courage or suicide. Bumpy doesn't move. His eyes, deep and sharp, dig into Frank's calm face. No shouting. No argument. Just the old king measuring the worth of the man before him. Finally, Bumpy leans back. The corner of his mouth lifts, not quite a smile. The test ends in silence. The bag remains untouched. Outside, Harlem keeps breathing, unaware that history has just tilted an inch. In the end, one choice separates echo from legend. Because in Harlem's Shadow Kingdom, saying no to Bumpy Johnson was suicide, but for Frank Lucas, that one word built an empire. If you want more untold stories like this, subscribe now. Real power moves in silence. Before Harlem knew his name, Frank Lucas was another face off the bus from North Carolina, carrying hunger behind his eyes and a silence that caught attention. He came from fields where sunburn and poverty shaped men harder than steel, and he brought that hardness north, chasing a rumor that a man named Bumpy Johnson ruled Harlem with elegance and fear, like a chess player sitting at the center of a storm. Frank started at the edges, running errands, watching who mattered. Harlem taught fast lessons. Guns made noise, brains made money. Frank preferred quiet. He noticed who spoke first in a room, and who never needed to. That second kind, the ones who made decisions without explanations, were the ones who lasted. It wasn't long before Bumpy noticed him. Maybe it was the way Frank listened when most men bragged. Maybe it was how he dressed, neat but never desperate. One night outside the Palm Cafe, Bumpy watched Frank step between two drunks ready to pull knives. Frank didn't raise his hands. He just stared, calm but deliberate, until the energy leaked out of the crowd like air from a tire. A man who could command peace without saying a word. Bumpy understood that kind of power. From that night forward, Frank rode with him. No titles, no promises. He absorbed Harlem's rules through Bumpy's movements, the handshakes that sealed borders, the quiet donations that kept the community loyal, the smile that disguised a warning. To outsiders, Bumpy was a crime boss. To his people, he was order in the chaos. A man who sat at tables with judges by day and street soldiers by night, fluent in both languages. Frank studied him like an apprentice studies a craft. Every lesson was coded wisdom. Always sit with your back against the wall. Never show need. Never show want. Loyalty, Bumpy would say, tapping the table as if striking a drumbeat. Before money, before power, before breath. Frank believed every word. He studied the tempo of Bumpy's conversations, how he could diffuse violence with a tone, how silence itself became a form of command. The older man carried dignity like an invisible weapon. It shielded him more effectively than any pistol. But inside Frank, ambition mixed with devotion. He admired Bumpy, yet somewhere beneath that reverence grew a restlessness. Bumpy had built his empire during segregation's heat, balancing favors with survival, bribing to protect the neighborhood. Frank saw that world fading. What Bumpy defined as diplomacy, Frank began to see as inefficiency. The underworld was evolving. Laws were softening. Money moved faster. Quietly, Frank promised himself he would keep Bumpy's lessons, but execute them differently, colder, smoother, beyond sentiment. Still, he served faithfully until the day everything changed. Harlem under Bumpy was its own government, taxed by bookmakers, governed by respect, enforced by attention. Bumpy's words settled disputes faster than police work ever could. He was feared not for what he did, but for what people believed he might do. That kind of rumor-based control fascinated Frank. He shadowed Bumpy constantly. At Harlem funerals, Bumpy bowed his head lower than anyone. At business meetings, his posture alone dissolved defiance. Frank memorized every ritual. He thought understanding Bumpy would one day make him like Bumpy. He didn't yet know that disciples often outgrow their scripture. In the mornings, when Bumpy read the paper in his tailored suit, Frank would wait nearby, hands clasped behind his back like a soldier. Every few minutes, Bumpy would share a thought, not about crime, but about survival, power, and time itself. He'd say, "Every man gets one moment when he has to choose between loyalty and success. I hope you never have to find out which one you really serve." Frank didn't answer then. He just nodded, absorbing the words the way a blade absorbs a sharpening stone, quietly, purposefully, unseen until tested. And somewhere above the hum of the city, Harlem's air carried the faint warning that the teacher's greatest pupil was already learning to think for himself. By the end of the 1960s, Harlem had changed shape again. The rhythm of the streets had quickened, new dealers, new enemies, new rules. The French Connection flooded the city with heroin so pure it rewrote the balance of power overnight. And for the first time in years, Bumpy Johnson felt time itself pressing against him. Age was creeping in quietly, like smoke under a locked door. He still commanded respect, but that respect had begun to sound like nostalgia. Young crews whispered that his time had passed, that his influence was fading beneath a new kind of greed. Louder, faster, less disciplined. Harlem now rewarded display more than restraint, and that shift unsettled him. He'd spent his life building a careful empire, part chessboard, part church, all bound by one fragile thread, loyalty. But whispers were spreading through that web. Someone, maybe inside his own house, was talking to the police. Names were being leaked, shipments lost, bribes traced. Every favor started coming with attached suspicion. In his private office, late one night, Bumpy sat under the yellow glow of a reading lamp, staring at the Harlem map pinned to his wall. Colored pins marked territories. Green for allies, red for rivals, blue for men he trusted. Lately, even the blue ones made him restless. He could feel panic pressing at the edges of his composure. The air smelled of aftershave and ink. Outside, he heard the muted thrum of the club, the sound of young men who didn't yet know fear the way he did. He called for Frank. When Frank entered, Bumpy's gaze was different, colder, heavier. It was no longer the look of a mentor watching a student. It was the look of a ruler assessing a possible threat. "We got problem, Frank," he said, each word deliberate. Somebody close been talking where they shouldn't. Frank remained still. He'd been hearing rumors too, agents asking questions about shipments, friends disappearing without farewell. He knew the pressure wasn't just on Bumpy, it was on all of Harlem. Bumpy leaned forward, elbows on the desk. "You've been with me long enough to know what betrayal costs." Frank nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." Bumpy opened the drawer, drew out a velvet bag. The same color as the night they first met. The same sound when it slid across polished wood. Inside, $1 million. Clean bills, freshly wrapped. One job, Bumpy said. Handle it right, and this disappears. Handle it wrong, and we both do. He spoke the name quietly, almost tenderly, as if trying not to wake the walls. It wasn't the name of a rival, or an enemy from another borough. It was the name of someone they both knew, someone too close. Frank looked at the bag, then back at his mentor. The number meant nothing to him. The name meant everything. Why me? Frank asked. Because I trust you more than I trust anyone else, Bumpy said. Then, after a pause, and because I need to know I still can. The moment hung, like damp air before a storm. Frank didn't speak. Bumpy's eyes stayed trained on him, half expecting obedience, half dreading it. It wasn't just an order, it was a mirror. A test shaped by fear more than confidence. In that instant, both men saw the truth neither could say aloud. When power begins to slip, loyalty becomes the only currency left, and the rarest. Frank closed the bag, but didn't take it. Not yet. He stood there long enough for Bumpy to notice the sharp steadiness in his face. No defiance. No weakness. Just a stillness that felt dangerous in its honesty. The silence between them filled the whole room, pressing down until even the city outside seemed to hold its breath. Because sometimes loyalty leaves you with a choice that can't be escaped, only survived. Because stories like this don't get told twice. Subscribe and don't miss the next name whispered in the dark. Frank left that night without the velvet bag. Not in anger, not in fear, just with a sense of quiet finality, the kind that follows a confession. Outside, the city's hum seemed to dim around him. Harlem at midnight had its own pulse, a rhythm built on danger and faith. He stepped into it like a man walking away from gravity itself. By dawn, word had already started to spread. Harlem didn't keep secrets, only versions of them. Men in barbershops, gamblers on stoops, and women at corner stands whispered the same headline. Frank Lucas said no to Bumpy. No one knew what that meant yet, whether it was an act of courage or suicide, but they agreed on one thing. Nobody else had ever done it and lived to tell. Inside the organization, unease settled like dust on polished shoes. Bumpy's lieutenants avoided his eyes, guessing what storm might follow. Those who'd once smiled around Frank now measured their words. He'd become a curiosity and a warning all at once. Bumpy said nothing publicly. He attended meetings as usual, gave orders as usual, but his silence was heavier than any outburst could have been. The man who once carved entire territories with a phrase now skipped conversations, looking through people instead of at them. At night, alone in his study, Bumpy sat unmoving beneath a soft yellow lamp. The ashtray filled and refilled. The paper on his desk still bore the name of the man he wanted gone, now crossed out, unhandled. Betrayal by refusal was something he'd never had to calculate before. He couldn't decide which hurt more, that Frank had disobeyed him, or that the world would soon know it. He turned the thought over in his mind. Maybe this was about pride. Maybe he'd mistaken ambition for loyalty. Maybe he'd created the one man who could afford not to fear him. For a man like Bumpy, that kind of independence was more dangerous than an informant. It was a mirror held too close. Across town, Frank walked the narrow line between survival and defiance. The city looked different now. Streetlights felt brighter, corners sharper, every sound nearer. He moved carefully, head low, but not hiding. He kept working, made his usual rounds, tipped waiters, looked everyone in the eye. By the second week, even the boldest voices stopped predicting a funeral. Something in Bumpy's stillness unsettled them. The longer he remained silent, the more nervous everyone became. Because Harlem had learned a terrifying truth, Bumpy only shouted when things were safe enough to fix. When he went quiet, it meant the decision had already been made. Frank went to church one morning. He didn't pray. He just sat in the last pew, thinking about what lines defined men like him and Bumpy. There were killers who thought themselves kings. There were kings who pretended to be shepherds. Somewhere between them, maybe, there was room for a man who could think before he acted. He didn't sleep much that week. He knew the call would come eventually. And it did. The car that arrived was clean, black, unhurried. Two of Bumpy's men stepped out, faces unreadable. Mr. Johnson wants to see you. No anger, no warning. Just that. When Frank entered Bumpy's office, the old man was looking out the window. No bodyguards, no cigar, no gun in reach. Just light spilling through the blinds, striping the floor like rungs on a ladder. You disobeyed me, Bumpy said, not turning around. Yes, sir, Frank answered. Why? Frank hesitated. Because the man you wanted gone didn't deserve it. A sound half between a laugh and a sigh escaped Bumpy. Deserve has nothing to do with power, Frank. He turned, finally. But I didn't ask because I needed a body gone. I asked because I needed to see whether you're ruled by me or by your own clarity. He crossed the room slowly, stopping a breath away. I gave you a choice. You found out who you really are. Be careful. You'll have to live with that. For the first time, Frank saw exhaustion in the man who once seemed eternal. Every empire, he realized, eventually teaches its builder that loyalty isn't about obedience. It's about alignment. They stood there in silence, teacher and student, ruler and heir, each understanding something the other could no longer say aloud. Bumpy extended his hand. Frank shook it. No apologies, no forgiveness. Just one last transaction of respect. When Frank left that room, the organization was still Bumpy's on paper. But everybody in Harlem could sense it, the quiet shift, the invisible handover. The crown hadn't been given. It had simply recognized its next keeper. And in the stillness that followed, a legacy began to move without footsteps. It happened quietly, as if Harlem itself had decided to exhale. One Sunday morning, in the middle of a diner, Bumpy Johnson set down his coffee, smiled faintly at a friend's remark, and never lifted the cup again. No gunfire, no warning, no drama, just stillness. For a man whose word had once carried the weight of life and death, it was an oddly merciful ending. Harlem stopped. Crowds filled 125th Street in suits and sorrow, speaking his name like prayer. Old rivals nodded in respect. Younger men weighed opportunity. Every empire bleeds confusion when its king is gone. This one was no different. In backrooms and bars, soldiers began asking the oldest question in the underworld. Who now? Fingers pointed, claims pressed, threats floated over cheap whiskey. Everyone wanted to be the next Bumpy. Everyone but one man. Frank Lucas said nothing. He didn't shoulder his way into leadership or make grand declarations. He simply went to work. The first move was logistical, not violent. He reached out beyond Harlem, beyond the boroughs, into shadows no one else thought reachable. A cousin stationed overseas. A quiet contact at an airbase. An idea whispered through coded calls. Bypass the middlemen, bring the product indirectly. Efficient, discreet, inevitable. People underestimated him because he kept his voice low. They expected a scramble. They got a system. Within months, Frank had architected something new, an operation that flowed like mathematics, each part feeding another with clean precision. Dealers were reduced, prices undercut, quality unmatchable. Rivals argued. Frank counted. Every decision echoed Bumpy's lessons, but without Bumpy's sentiment. Keep dignity. Control your face. Never move first, only move well. He did not seek revenge against those who doubted him. He didn't need to. His wealth became its own declaration. Streets that once hesitated to say his name now said it with curiosity, then respect, then fear. The metamorphosis was so calm that by the time Harlem realized who ruled, it already belonged to him. And through it all, Frank remembered the last conversation in that office, the question Bumpy had asked him. Who are you? Each business meeting, each shipment, each calculated silence was his answer. He was not the new Bumpy. He was the result of Bumpy's design taken to its logical extreme. While others paraded their strength, Frank's dominance lived in invisibility. The quieter he grew, the more Harlem rearranged itself around his silence. His warehouses ran with clockwork efficiency. His men, unlike the swaggering soldiers of other crews, spoke in low tones, wore neat suits, paid bills on time. They weren't thugs, they were infrastructure. The irony deepened with every dollar that piled up. Years earlier, a younger Frank had refused $1 million to kill a man. Now he was making that much weekly, maybe daily, depending on the shipment schedule. The act that once marked him as defiant had become the blueprint for everything he achieved. This wasn't chaos, this was design. Power executed with the patience of an engineer. Reporters began calling him a ghost, a man who existed everywhere but could never be pinned down. Detectives compared notes, puzzled at the absence of the usual noise. Competitors thought he must be blessed or protected, but the truth was simpler. Frank operated by Bumpy's oldest rule in its purest form: control the perception, and you control the game. At dinner one night, staring into a glass of scotch, Frank found himself thinking not of wealth or territory, but of the old man across that last table, and the unsaid understanding that had passed between them. Bumpy had known Harlem was changing. He'd needed someone who could survive the next era without breaking its code of command. That night, as lights dimmed across 116th Street, Frank realized he already had. The inheritance wasn't the crown, it was the silence that came with it. Harlem, in the 1970s, glowed like a jewel with cracks running through it. Neon bled across wet pavement, jazz bled into funk, and money, dirty or clean, moved faster than conscience. Amid the noise, one man walked through the city with the calm of someone untouchable. Frank Lucas. No more apprentice. No more shadow. Just presence, tailored, measured, impossible to ignore. He didn't inherit Harlem. He redesigned it. When reporters called him Black Caesar, he didn't correct them. He only smiled. The faintest nod that said he already knew titles meant less than tone. Cameras caught him stepping out of limousines, broad-shouldered in hand-stitched suits from Seville Row, rings glinting like punctuation marks. But those who once stood beside Bumpy Johnson saw something behind that polish, a familiar quiet, the same centered gravity that had once held Harlem together. Continuity without ceremony. The press called him ruthless. His competitors called him strategic. But the ones who'd watched that fabled meeting years ago called him something else entirely: disciplined. They remembered the night he turned down a bag filled with blood money. That act, not his empire, was the axis on which his legend turned. Because refusing Bumpy wasn't an act of defiance. It was the purest expression of understanding. Every shipment he moved, every calculated negotiation, every discreet deal, each of them traced back to that one moment under Bumpy's watchful stare, when Frank chose thought over impulse. The world believed his fortune came from a new way of doing business. Harlem knew better. It came from a new way of being in business. Even as authorities began to circle briefcases of evidence, whispered deals, quiet betrayals, Frank remained unshaken. When indictments landed, his demeanor didn't falter. While rivals shouted or vanished, he arranged his defense like another move on a chessboard. His composure alone unsettled prosecutors. They couldn't quite decide whether they were chasing a criminal or taking notes from a strategist. Bumpy had once said real power wasn't noise, it was duration. Longevity was the unspoken throne. Frank understood that now. The empire he built was enormous, but the true accomplishment was psychological. A statement that power could live in absolute restraint. One evening, as twilight poured gold over the brownstones, a few of Bumpy's old lieutenants gathered outside Small's paradise. They spoke quietly about the old days, the codes that used to matter. When Frank's car passed, not one of them spoke his name aloud. But each man touched a hand to his chest for half a second, a private salute. They understood. The crown had moved, not gifted, not stolen, just recognized. Frank never celebrated victory. He didn't need to. The city itself reflected it back in the respect that accompanied even his downfall. He lived like he spoke, slow, precise, and only when necessary. In Harlem, power wasn't inherited. It was earned by those who knew when to stay silent. If this story of power, loyalty, and silent authority moved you, like, share, and subscribe. Because legacies like this are the history they never teach. No empire outlasts gravity. Frank Lucas' rise became inevitable, and so did his fall. The headlines wrote themselves: indictments, seizures, handcuffs heavy enough to feel like prophecy. What the law couldn't crush, exposure did. But power, real power, rarely dies with property. It lingers in memory, shaping how men define success long after the crowns are gone. In holding to a single choice, Frank had already carved his legend. He'd taken Bumpy Johnson's doctrine, loyalty before power, and stripped of sentiment. Bumpy pledged loyalty to men. Frank pledged it to principle. Where others saw disobedience, Frank found alignment. His wealth was shocking, his discipline more so. No rival could mimic his silence, and no follower truly understood it. They copied his suits, his cars, his caution, but not the philosophy. Frank's genius wasn't how he moved money. It was how he moved restraint. When the empire collapsed, those who once called him arrogant began to realize he'd simply been consistent. He'd built an enterprise according to the same law that had saved his life: never act from noise. The patience that made him rich also kept his spirit intact when the walls closed in. Years later, the myth of that million-dollar refusal outlived every courtroom story. People argued over details, over morality, over cost, but they all came back to the same unseen lesson. It's not the fortune that defines a man, it's the moment he decides what he won't do to get it. What made Frank richer than his teacher was not betrayal. It was interpretation. He learned that leadership isn't domination, it's direction, not command, but composure. The underworld, for all its devils, still respected that truth. He could have earned $1 million with a gun. He built a fortune with a decision.